Welcome to the show. We are the Authentics.
I'm Jay Binkowitz, and we're ready to dive in to some good conversation.
I'm Dr. Essence Johnson, and this is The Authentics.
Hey, everybody. How you doing?
Great.
Hi there.
Industry friends, another episode of The Authentics. Thanks for being here. Our title of tonight's show is Pitfalls in Creating Optometry Businesses. And we want to address why it costs so much to start practices from scratch or purchase an existing practice. Before we get going, we always want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you get timely announcements for future shows. And we just want to acknowledge that tonight, a couple of our key Authentic members, Essence Johnson and Jennifer Stewart, are unable to be here. And as the collective is, there's times where the power of all of us will be here, and there'll be times where some of us are absent. So we look forward to seeing the two of them on the next show. Now to the topic. We feel as though it costs too much to start a practice from scratch, and we're seeing all kinds of services started that can help guide doctors on this journey to make starting a practice or buying a practice more feasible. So we see these legacy practices that aren't targets for private equity, and we see people not starting cold starts as much as they could, although there are some good folks out there helping them. We know that doctors often want to, become eye care business owners, but then they also struggle with the services they choose to deliver, the equipment they buy or lease, their vendor partners, and everything else. So Jay and Mick, I know you've talked on this subject a lot from the stage in various places. I'd like you guys to take the lead on this conversation. Let's get it going.
Thanks, Scott. This is a hot topic. The real legacy of independent optometry and everything moving forward. When we look in the past to look forward, it's always been the independent optometrist. And Mick and I have spent a tremendous amount of time at quite a few expos, trying to teach people the numbers and the things to think about as they go into business, as they value their business, the different components, critical building blocks of the business is something Mick and I will be talking about at Vision Expo West coming up. And yet there are so many obstacles. And when this topic came up, we all kind of looked at it and said, hey, yeah, this is not an easy thing to do. It's not like back in the day, you could open up a practice for a few bucks. You didn't need a computer system. You didn't need EHR. You wrote what you did on a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It got tucked in the drawer. Maybe you found it when the patient came back. It was just much simpler back in the day. And I won't tell you what back in the day really means for me. But to that degree, it's a complex business. It's intimidating for a lot of folks. And yet at the same time, I know I personally sat back and said, what are we doing as an industry to support those that have the motivation, the drive, the desire to take on the responsibilities of owning a practice? It's not the way it used to be. Mick?
Yeah, I think one thing that appeals to a lot of people about our profession is the fact that we can be our own business owner. And, I think back on my journey. I, from day one, always just envisioned that I would own my own practice. I never thought that there would be any other pathway. And I know the world has changed a lot, certainly in the last 30 years. But one of the things that I've noticed is it seems like there's still that really strong desire, especially early. So for the first year optometry students still have that really strong desire, but something changes in that journey through school. And I think really the barrier for most of them is by the time they get to their fourth year, they're feeling so burdened by student loan debt that they just give me a job. Just give me a job and benefits. Give me some financial security because I'm not sure how I'm going to make this work. And I think it's unfortunate, but a lot of that dream sort of dwindles away. And then what happens, unfortunately, is they get tied to that comfortable feeling, making some money, get married, have a family. Next thing you wake up 10 years later and you've never really fulfilled that dream. And so one thing that I'm really focused on is really how can we help? What can we do to help optometry students through that journey not lose that vision and still be as excited at their fourth year to go into practice ownership as they were when they started the profession? Because I really don't think people go to optometry school, say, I want to go to become a doctor so I can go work for somebody else. Some do, I suspect. Some want to be maybe in hospital systems. But I suspect most of the entering first year students want to own their own practice.
Ed, you had asked a question when we were off screen. I thought that was a great question. Why don't you throw it out there?
Well, what I was questioning is the premise that the majority of ODs want to be in private, independent practice. Certainly being the senior fellow in this group, I do remember those days when I was visiting schools, and I think everybody wanted to be in private practice. I'm not sure over the last 5 to 10 years that that goal and that desire is as strong as it used to be. Even in first year students, Mick, I mean, maybe you've got more exposure to the schools, but I think that, they see the opportunity in retail or commercial, whatever we want to call it. And they do make a good living with benefits, and it seems to be an easier path for a lot of students.
Well, the other big change in the profession is the demographics, and I think this optometry is really an excellent profession for somebody who doesn't want to work full time. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are lots of part-time opportunities. Now, we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the reality is you can work 2 or 3 days a week, maybe 4 days a week, and still make a decent living. And so typically, if that's your mindset, you don't want to lean in 100% from a work standpoint, then obviously it's hard to own a practice when you only want to work 3 days a week. So I think that's the change of the dynamics of the demographics has had some influence as well.
It's so interesting. I think, and Alan, I think you could speak to this because you're a legacy, not just a legend. You're a legacy, but to that extent, there are many legacy practices out there. Dr. Gaddy's dad started his first practice, and then he built it out to multiple locations, and so I think that generational legacy has been broken by private equity, in so much as these practices. They can't afford to hand them off to their kids. Private equity came in and paid so much money for them that it's almost like a generation of kids lost the opportunity to take over mom and dad's practice because it made more sense for mom and dad to sell their practice to private equity and really cash in big bucks and then give the kid the money they needed to start their own practice versus handing them their practice, which was their retirement. So I think in some ways the chain was broken.
I think that's interesting, Jay, and I'm not going to argue against that. I'm going to present a little different picture. Private equity in our industry is cyclical, and we're only on, I believe, the third cycle of it. And private equity, I equate it to an apple tree, where an apple orchard, where the workers pick the ripe apples. Private equity comes after the $1+ million practices generally. I mean, there are companies out there buying smaller practices, of course. I'm speaking in generalizations. And then the apples that are green and growing, those $500,000, I don't know what the range would be, but green and growing are left to mature and to be picked again at some point. But if it's not the top of a private equity cycle, they're not going to get those valuations. And then you have, unfortunately for us as optometrists, you see a lot of the rotten apples, people whose practices aren't well managed, and they don't have, someone like you or Mick or Ed, to help them grow, and they end up being an asset sale. And this cycle happens, and I think the private equity thing just runs alongside of it. I think what the bigger issue is what Nick said, is the change in the demographics of the profession and why people go into optometry more than the private equity, but no doubt the private equity had an impact on that.
Yeah. Listen.
So what's the impact? Let's go back to what Mick said about education. I mean, is the cost of education plus the cost of doing a cold start really that much more of an issue than it was for me in 1991 in proportional dollars? I mean, I was $108,000 in debt in 1991. That included the principal that had been the interest that had been put into principal, and my practice, I took another loan for another 65 grand plus whatever equipment, probably another 100. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an economist, so I don't know. But do we think it's that much more, or is it just the load of the feel of $250,000, like a job and maybe a paycheck matters?
Yeah, I'll tell you one thing that I've learned. I work a lot with the banks in my role with practice transitions, and I'll tell you, so a couple things. One, of course, student loan debt is much higher now than it was when we were in school, Scott. So that's a big factor. But then again, over the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in the cost for build out. So in the old days, they would usually lend, let's say, $350,000 to build a practice. Now they need 450,000 because of just merely the cost of construction. So if you have, let's say, $250,000 worth of student loan debt, and then another 450,000 in practice startup costs, you're $600,000 or $700,000 in the hole day one. And cold start practices usually take at least 18 months to even get cash flow even. And so it's a long road. Some of the banks are slow to increase their lending limits for cold starts, and so the aggressive banks that are willing to lend more tend to get the majority of the business, and the ones that have sort of been lagging, maybe a little bit more conservative with their lending, sometimes won't even lend enough to even open a cold start.
That's a significant mountain to ask someone to climb now. You're looking at $750,000 before $1's really happening. At the same token, you're saying, hey, you may have to work a day or two part-time there while you're working 5 days a week there while you may have a family. So you're really asking someone, that's an all-in situation. No, that's for sure. And your numbers, Mick, they're spot on and even higher. That's not even a full boat, total blowout practice, right? That's saying, get your doors open. Here's what you need to get open. You'll add more things as you go.
And does that 450 include working capital?
Yeah, and it doesn't.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting statement, Ed, because for years, Mick and I have said the same thing. How many folks opened up their practice expecting to draw income on year one? Right. And that's just not realistic. And so, we would talk about, we still talk about, forecasting out an 18-month cash flow shortage. In other words, don't plan on paying yourself the first 18 months. Now, how much money do you need to operate your practice and make sure that you can be healthy? And what Mick said is spot on. That $400,000 or $500,000 number is easily spent on top of the education. And that brings us to a very significant question from my perspective is, what are we doing as an industry to make this happen for these young folks who do have the drive, that do have the motivation, that do have the competencies to own and run a business? I think, the alliance groups, doesn't matter who you want to belong to, have done a tremendous job of bringing resources and knowledge to the table for many, many people. I mean, I don't know how anybody could open up without an alliance group, a relationship, because what do you know? You don't know anything. And to that degree, that's where you're going to find knowledge. That's where you're going to learn how to have relationships. But still, at the end of the day, you're opening up with a big nut. You have a cash flow shortage. You're not going to be $1 million practice in a year. So how are you going to handle that? And so as much as the alliance groups do a tremendous service for independent optometry, from my perspective, I don't believe the industry, or I'm not aware of the industry really doing everything it could do to support the growth of independent optometry.
Before we bring in our guests, I want to ask on the other end of the equation, the dying on the vine practice, right? I mean, is it still a huge capital nut? Are we to the point where we got past the post-World War II educated docs selling practices for the kind of prices I paid 30 years ago? Is everyone expecting a big golden parachute at the end of practice that keeps those practices from becoming viable? Because to your point, Alan, they're not in the cycle of private equity purchase. There's decent practices, lower volume. Somebody could make $100,000 a year out of school operating them. Are they just not viable?
Well, I think one of the big influencers that I've seen is it seems like this generation of ODs do not want to be in the country. They do not want to be in rural areas at all. There are, I put on a course on how to buy a practice, and we talk about the difference between rural and urban practices and just simply the economics of the difference. And the main two primary differences are the cost of occupancy, real estate, and the cost of wages. And so practices in rural areas tend to hire for less. They don't have to pay as much, and they tend to get real estate for less. And those can be extremely profitable practices, but nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to practice there. And so every year, we have dozens and dozens of practices that literally just shut their doors because they don't have a buyer.
It is interesting for those who are looking for a different quality of life and that are willing to relocate and put down roots. And I refer to them as islands. Those a little bit more remote practices, they could do extraordinarily well. But it's really all on them. It's really all on them. And that is a significant commitment to make, to say not only you're going into a practice, but you're going to be the only boat in the marina. That's a difficult situation. But yet so many have done so well in the past by really mastering that and being the big fish in the little pond. There's nothing wrong with that. The question is, do our young folk today really want to park themselves in a remote environment?
There's a paradigm shift that is starting to happen. I believe it's starting at the schools. I'm not sure, maybe Mick can comment, but I think even Vision Source is providing kind of, how if you historically, if you promise to serve in the military, they defray some of your educational costs. We're starting to see that now in rural America. If you go work, I believe NECO has one program, or at least one other school where if you commit to work in rural America for a couple of years, they'll defray some of your educational expense. And I think it's an amazing model because once you get there, you may, you can settle there. Who knows? It's just.
David Freefield made comment here.
It's helping us penetrate and provide these opportunities. I think it's a great model. Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, a lot of organizations, a lot of corporate are building programs, military GI Bill, where if you come serve in an underserved area, we'll offset some student loan debt. We'll do some loan forgiveness. We'll pay for some of your tuition. And Vision Source, as you mentioned, Alan, we have a program like that as well, where we'll be able to cover some of the student tuition when they serve in practices that otherwise would struggle to find associate doctors. We have in our ecosystem, we have probably 500 associate positions available in private practice. And then when you add on top of that, all of the corporate locations, LensCrafters probably has 1,000 positions across the country. It's a lot of job. If you're an optometrist looking for work, there's never been a better time. So I think they can be picky and choosy, and they can go to the towns that they want to be in, and they don't have to go to the country if they don't want to.
Yes. Mick, how much impact is the cost of money today having on new practice startups, or even buying a dying practice, as we referred to it?
Yeah, certainly the cost of borrowing money as interest rates goes up makes it more difficult. That doesn't help the situation at all. What the bankers always tell me, they always like to remind me, just remember the interest rates are still historically low. And that's probably true, but we got used to 3% and 4% interest, right. And now when it's 6.5%, 7%, it feels really expensive to borrow money. But it really does make an impact on the cash flow, the difference in the interest rates.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I know some of us, certainly not me, remember when there was double-digit interest rates. That's way before my time, and yet businesses still opened up and thrived.
Jay, my student loans interest rate was 14%
Wow.
back in the late 80s, early 90s. 14%.
Wow.
I think it's a reasonable thing to talk about the willingness of both the sellers of those legacy practices and what we've heard today so far from students that don't want to be in rural places. I mean, my buddy up in Plattsburgh, New York, which is not far from Montreal, is shutting it down. And it's painful. It's painful to think about it. But before we go any further on any of this, I want to discuss our guests. First, the Authentics had originally planned the participation of our friend Bob Steinmetz from Eye Care Advisors, but they had a scheduling conflict and caused them to be unable to attend. And so we got this fantastic last-minute pinch hit from Erich Mattei from Akrinos. He provides cold start advisory services, and I can see him backstage laughing his tail off at what we're talking about. So welcome, Erich, to the show.
Eric.
Hey, it is incredible to be here. And yeah, I have been like laughing my face off behind the scenes backstage because I'm filled with excitement, right? Because as this conversation has kind of evolved, I think we've touched on a few critical pieces, which I suppose we'll jump into. But before that, hello, everyone. Dr. Jens, Jay, Ed, Dr. Glazer, Dr. Kling. It's great to be here. Dr. Stewart, Dr. Johnson, I know y'all couldn't be here. Y'all had sent me some messages earlier, but really looking forward to seeing where this conversation goes and hopefully perhaps lend a couple thoughts along the way.
So what did this last back and forth make your head think? What we're talking about the cost of money, right? We're talking. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I guess through all of this, I mean, look, y'all, as it pertains to interest rates and this and that and the current lending environment, whatever sort of variables you want to kind of toss into the equation, there are a lot of entities out there that see the opportunity in independent eye care, independent optometry. And so look, and as I look around, I know, Mick, I know you work with a lot of practices and your business workshops and everything you do, and I know there's a whole lot of players out there that are ready to come around optometry and really embrace it. Why? Because they see the opportunity. And I think that's where I kind of see this conversation going in one of two directions. One being the mechanics of things. Okay, the actual costs, construction costs. Hey, even just keeping a contractor on target, y'all. I mean, it's insane, right? But I think also at the same time, we're talking about a lot of these kind of like fundamental structural things. And by the way, for viewers out there, don't let, oh my gosh, I got to work with a contractor that makes me uncomfortable. Don't let that keep you from it, because there's a lot of really great resources, teams, what have you out there that are here to represent you and help you through it. But I think outside of the mechanics of the business of it is also just maybe talking about entrepreneurship. And I kind of feel like that's part of this that needs to be part of the dialogue. And I say that because right now, today, we are working with folks that are as recently out of school as we've got someone, graduate of the class of 2021, literally came out of optometry school in 21. We may have their doors open by the end of the year. So I think at the same time, we're talking about a lot of these business fundamentals, just talking about like the entrepreneurial spirit. And perhaps maybe that's where I'd like to maybe toss something out to the group here. I mean, everyone here in the panel that make up the Authentics, I mean, entrepreneurs, be it in practice or whatever you've gotten into. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation, right? Because if we want to talk about like, hey, how much does it cost to start a practice? Are banks willing to lend? I will tell you, yes. It costs X amount based on what? Based on where you're located, what your scope of care is, X, Y, Z, what have you. But
so our students just not doing it because our buddy entrepreneur just said, you got to work 12-hour days and you got to, live lean in order to do it. Are there just not enough young doctors or doctors that are candidates for buying a practice that have been out a while and want to get into a business ownership position, not willing to put in that work in your experience?
I suppose in our experience, we're getting the folks that are raising their hands and are saying, "Hey, let's do this." And when I share the degree to which everyone's backgrounds is so radically diverse, and everyone's vision is really cool and unique. I mean, I'm kind of, and I suppose if there's one message I could toss out here, it's like, if you're tuning into this and you've got even like the slightest little idea to cold start something, or the fixer upper on the other side of town, and you're wondering, how do I have the conversation with them and say, "Hey, I'd like to buy your practice"? Like, raise your hand, come out of the woodwork. And I'm not saying like reach out to us necessarily. I mean, look, I know Dr. Steenmetz couldn't join, and by the way, thank you all so much for the opportunity to be a part of the conversation. But
Absolutely.
there are so many resources out there amongst independent advisors, amongst vision source networks, alliances, what have you. But the opportunity is there. And I suppose it's the one thing I'll toss out there is working so closely with folks who are coming to us with, they've got $200,000 worth of student loans, but they're ready to get the show on the road. And there are ways it can be done. So I think I'll
ask you a question.
you all. I mean, go ahead, Jay.
That's a good question. First of all, your energy is intoxicating. I love listening to you talk, and I'm extremely appreciative for what you're doing for the field. I mean, absolutely, 3 A's across the board. I even downloaded your Building a Modern Optometry Practice today, so I could check out some of your numbers. I may be familiar with some numbers occasionally, but one of my momentary obsessions, they come and go, is are we doing enough as an industry to help these folks really get out of the gate? It's one thing for us to sit back and say, hey, there's maybe less people looking for it. There's more remote practices. There's some practices that are dying on the vine, which is, makes your heart bleed that some folks are walking away from practices. We understand the dynamics of the new graduates, and we understand the growth in the industry potential. We understand that optometrists in general are worth more today than they were 5 years ago, in part because of the growth in population, the growth in demand for medical services, the fact that there isn't a cadence to keep up with that on our graduates. So it's creating what I like to call it a drought. Not that I like a drought, it's just how I perceive it. But all that aside, let's say we have 5 people in front of us right now and raise their hand and say, I want to go into business. What in industry is helping them really do it? Alliance groups, hands down. They all have great programs. They all have support. They have lots of experienced people. But from a financial standpoint of view, the biggest guns in the industry, what are they really coming to the table with to say to these young folks, we're going to make your entree into private practice a little bit easier. We're going to take some stress off that first year or two. We're going to get you out of the gate. You'll pay us back later. I don't see enough of that happening. I see a lot of folks coming to the table, knocking on these kids' doors, saying, you need this, you need this, you need this, you need this, spend money on this, and this. And before they blink their eye, they have bought things that may or may not need from right out of the gates. I can't count how many times in my career I was brought into situations where people absolutely bought too much and were sold too much out of the gates, and they struggled for years and years to climb out of that till they could see daylight. So what do we, again, my question keeps going back to the root. What are we doing as an industry? What do you see happening from industry that's helping these kids get out of the gate without freaking out?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because if we're talking about as industry, who are we talking about? Are we talking about where power is consolidated? I mean, so like if we look over the last 15 years in healthcare, right? Not just in optometry, but across healthcare, we've seen radical consolidation across how care is being delivered, the role of managed care in the equation. It's certainly in eye care, the role of the supply chain. So as we've seen this consolidation in these areas, that voice has become louder and louder. I mean, I think earlier in the conversation, someone brought up, industry getting involved in optometry schools, in education, and kind of this, similar to someone who mentioned, like similar to joining the military and then they'll pay off your
Yeah.
school. It's kind of like, hey, sign on with us. And look, so I'm down here, New Orleans, Louisiana. We've got a, big Oxford Health Systems, big hospital network system down here in the Gulf South. And yeah, I mean, they'll do some really far out things. Come sign on with us for X number of years. We'll alleviate all of your student loans or whatever the case may be. But getting back to it, if those are the powers that be, then it's kind of like we come then to see that the options available are what are being handed down by them, which, and by the way, and this is not to take sides by any means. So I hope this not like an us and them, like
No. This
Pink
is
Floyd,
this is
us
just
and
put
them
it out
here.
there. This is just put it
But-
out there.
No, absolutely. But when we really do see then what then are the avenues available, that's it at any given point in time. And I suppose that's where I feel like dialogues like this, and there's so many amazing platforms now, publications, opportunities for kind of minds to come together and just share these ideas, because I'll tell you, Jay, I mean, if you ask me about all these other independents and startups out there, what are they doing? Wow, man, there's a vast network of amazing companies and people that are doing far out things, making it happen. But it's not necessarily on that path because it's not backed by the money, right? The conglomerates per se.
Well,
so
right. I mean, that's actually a question I have for you, and maybe you too, Mick. Nothing against joining a Doctor Alliance group. I think that the peer connections matter, and I think that the discounted vendor programs matter. But are there broad, non-doctor group related opportunities docs can have? I know that some of the organizations like Akrinos and others bring a slate of vendor partners and say, use these, right? They've negotiated the deal, but are the vendors stepping up? Like, are they really stepping up? Are the frame companies, the lens companies saying, for the first 3 years, you've got this assurance on cost of goods? Or do you have to kind of like spend also to pay for the Doctor Alliance group membership and other things you get them? I don't know, but I'm asking you guys if you're aware of anything, because I think what we're all saying is the critique is the industry really doing something, or can we actually encourage them through this dialogue? Do you know, Mick, if that's available outside of a doctor group?
No, that's a really good question. I don't know, and it's probably vendor by vendor, but maybe some vendors have, new to practice programs where they might give special discounts or they might give special terms to repay if you're purchasing equipment. I'm not familiar. I certainly don't think there's any concerted effort in the industry to do it. As a group of vendors, certainly on the Vision Source side, I mean, that's what we try to support, and I know that's what Erich does with the work that he does. Outside of the alliances and the consultants, I would be surprised if there's anything horribly organized.
Yeah.
And that is so key to, I think, the heart of we could help so many folks who have the desire to go into practice. Now, coming out of the gate 1 or 2 years out, they're not ready for it. But let's say 3 to 5 years out, they're itching. And they should be itching for those who are really intending to take advantage of it. What kind of programs are, lens companies, frame companies, what kind of programs are they walking in the door with? And my experience is really not a lot. Very often I've heard, hey, they belong to an alliance group, they get the best deals already. But that doesn't help them open the door. So really, what are they coming out of the gate with? And I'm not just saying lab and frames, anybody in the industry, what are they coming out of the gate with to say, hey, we're going to make sure that your first year, because obviously that's a critical year, the first 12 to 18 months is such a volatile time for folks where they're learning how to have a business. They're learning about everything. They're learning about RCM. They're learning about billing. They're learning about coding. They're learning about collecting. They're learning about having communications with patients that they've never had to have before because now they own the place. They're learning about leadership and management and doing every single job in the practice. What are we doing, as an industry to say, you know what, we're going to make your first 12 to 18 months easier. You may have to make a commitment to somebody by signing on board with that, and that's fair game. but I don't see enough real financial support going out to these folks to make sure they're successful when they start.
Ed, I mean, you and Alan, you guys work with industry companies. Ed, you are an industry, guy. You have been your whole career. Is that common? Is there anything out there you know of, either of you?
I don't really think there's ever been a coordinated program. And to Jay's point, I think you might have to sign contracts or agreements, but I think loyalty is in question today more than ever before too. So what kind of longevity could a vendor partner expect? And how do you enforce an agreement like that? And Eric, I'm curious, how do you guide a cold start practice in selecting a vendor? What are the criteria? I mean, is it discounts? I mean, is it going through a buying group or an alliance group? How do you counsel cold start practices?
This may sound old fashioned, but there's basically two measures for us, right? One, good stuff. It's got to be quality stuff, right? And two, good people. That's the extent of it. And that's what I was going to toss out here. And it's fascinating, right? And again, this is where, I mean, I live in this, I'm in these trenches all day, every day, right? Finger on the pulse. I'm here to say there are companies out there that want to play ball and go all in with cold starts. As it were, that's where I feel some of what it's our duty to do is to help all these folks. And perhaps, I mean, even there's just one viewer right now out there that's like tuning into this at the end of a long day on a Monday and is like, wow, this is just what I needed to hear to be like, you know what? I'm going to do it tomorrow because it can be done. Truly. So I think from a dollars and cents standpoint, and something else I'll say is this, now we live in an age where you can have a cold start practice and literally have like a pretty decent book pretty much out of the blocks. It's called the internet. It's called SEO. It's called omnichannel. It's called all of these things that are part of like launching a business now that even 20 years ago, as a matter of fact, prepping for tonight's call, I was like, let me look at a few stats just in case we go the numbers route. So it's like looking at like, cumulative inflation since 2003 when I was like a junior in college. And I think like, wow, 20 years. Okay. A lot's changed in 20 years. As far as launching a business, an optometrist who would have cold started in 23 versus someone who's cold starting right now, I would not trade launching in 23 for the world. Why? The ability to connect with so many people and the scope of care that a modern optometrist is capable of providing. Like it's a no-brainer, So from a numbers, dollars and cents standpoint, I think, and look, y'all know, I mean, I've been around the industry since 2010. I launched Akrinos in the summer of 21. So obviously my data set is a bit newer, but also I think this newer data set kind of lends itself to perhaps changing some of this narrative that I think we all agree is high time to change. Otherwise this wouldn't be a conversation for, like a topic,
But it is back to the vendor question. Good people and good products only get you so far. I know pricing matters to you, and I'm not asking for your secret sauce. But
sure.
But like Steinmetz from the road, he's on the road. He's listening, and he said 450 includes working capital. You can get it done for that. That's lean.
Oh, absolutely.
That's lean.
That is lean.
So. Yeah. What are they giving you guys that do cold start work? Are they giving you some opportunities that are not seen otherwise, and they have to ask for carefully or get representation from a cold starts advisory to get those prices?
And this is where I think I speak for both us and Bob and Eric and eye care advisors. Like none of us, no financial motive in anything we do. And I think we'll all be the first to say, like, really, and I say this all the time, buy your product through your state association connections. And if you want to ensure you're getting the best, pull us into the deal, because we've got enough connections across this industry. And by the way, and this may take the conversation in another direction as it pertains to supporting the profession, right? So, like, again, I mean, we've got, Dr. James, you had mentioned earlier, like, do we have negotiated deals? Yeah, presumably so, but we funnel all of that through
to the doc. Yeah.
The relationships that we have come to have, we get the deal for them. And people want to work with us because we really remove ourselves from all of this. So yes, I'm here to say absolutely, like, 2 thumbs up. Vendors want to play. Vendors want to play. And that's where I think,
want to play and want to, vendors want to be in the game, because if they don't get in the game and don't have that relationship, they don't have tomorrow. But how much are they willing to put their foot in the water with that person? I have a little sidebar going here with David Freefield. Surprisingly, David's usually a very quiet person. Usually I don't hear much from him. Most people probably don't even know who David Freefield is. But I get it. That being said, David and I are kind of going back and forth on, and David says, Jay, so easy. Put together a group of vendors to help cold starts. I'm on. When is our first meeting? I can get a good lens company, equipment, etc. This is easy. That's really the answer. What David just said is the answer. We need to have a room full of people, folks, vendors of all types from the industry that say, okay, here's what we can do, which is above and beyond. You're part of Alliance Group. Forget about that. You need that. You want that. That's good. I've always spoken positively about those relationships, but I think Scott's right. You can have other relationships as well. But put all that aside, we need vendors to say, hey, this kid needs 600,000, 500,000, 400,000. They need to feed their family. And by doing that, if we are able to put together a real financial picture where industry is investing in these practices, right? Then we take the stress off. Imagine how many more people would open up practices if we could make that barrier to opening up the front door on day one that much easier. Imagine how many more people would be employed, how many more independents would be at the game. It would be an explosion of independent optometry again. And that's what I'm striving for. I want to see that explosion.
I got a question for you, a little devil's advocate. That's a beautiful sentiment.
Hey, don't talk about my sentiments, all right, buddy?
What happens when this doctor who's getting all this support and all, I'm assuming these are discounts on their first frame inventory or consignment, opens up down the street from a doctor who's been there 10, 15 years and the same vendors are helping this person come into their community and take some of their business. What kind of, do you see any kind of challenges with that and how it's going to impact the local economy of eye care and what people might think about that?
Are you saying there's only a select group of vendors that would be involved in that?
I'm not saying anything. I'm saying, there's a competitive concern here. Some company that may work with these other doctors is helping somebody open up in their area and undercutting their lowest prices. I imagine that would be a challenge for an organization like Vision Source, Mick, right?
Well, Alan, you're spot on, which is why in the Vision Source ecosystem we have territories. And so when you become a member, and I'm not here to pitch Vision Source, obviously, but when you become a member, you own the territory, so nobody else can come in as a Vision Source practice. But I think, Eric, that's where I saw some recent cold start data that was mind-blowing. And at year five, they were generating revenue almost the size of the average optometry practice in the country. So there are some cold starts that are seeing explosive growth. That's the average. So we have, I know of practices that year 3 are over $1 million in revenue. We have those in our network. So there's explosive growth. So picking the location is critical. And I think, Alan, to your point, you wouldn't want to set up across the street from somebody. You would put the vendor in a very tough situation if they were going to offer some sort of special deals. But Eric, I'd love to get your take on the importance of location with a cold start.
Oh, absolutely. And particularly, I suppose there's a couple things that factor into it. And this is where I like to encourage everyone, like, there's so many, to remind everyone, there's so many folks out there that want to make this vision come to reality, right? So like if you think about like building your team, right? The role of the realtor, the role of all these folks on your team to bring it to reality. But from the standpoint of location, what is that? I think there was some stat like over 90% of patients that go to an optometrist's office reside within 5 miles of that location. But there's a couple of critical pieces that play into location. And that is going to be obviously the marketability of it, right? But also is going to be, and sometimes what's overlooked in the context of that is also going to be the actual cost, right? The occupancy cost, the build out costs. I mean, and now's where I think we come into some of when we talk about, the topic of tonight's conversation, what does it cost so much to build a practice? This is where we start to get into some numbers, right? Because I mean, you can have a practice that's a vanilla shell that's going to be a big lift to get this thing built out. Flip side of the coin, you could have something that was, a chiropractor office prior. You knock out one wall to open an optical, put in some plumbing, and you're ready to go live, So as it pertains to location, we think of marketability of it and really understanding, and this is something that I have a lot of fun conversations around, and it's this whole concept of if you build it, they will come, or give them what they want. And this is where I think, and I know, Mick, working with it's as much with cold starts and transitions as you do, getting into like the geospatial analysis. I mean, if you understand, the better you can understand that demographic that resides in that magic little radius around your practice, give them what they want. Now, that's where I'll say for a cold start, if you've got this really marvelous, precise vision that you want to bring to market, understand where you're going to place it so that you're putting in an ideal location. I think we get back to someone said something earlier of like, invested all this money, bringing in all this equipment, and then it's like there's crickets. There's no one coming in the door, like you didn't build what they wanted, But getting back to it, Mick, yeah, I location, looking at it from the standpoint of marketability of the scope of care products, but also I think part of that from a budgetary standpoint is understanding. I mean, there can be radically different terms of leases in a very short distance from one another. You can find some radically different lease opportunities in terms, and also build out costs, which I think also plays radically. We were talking earlier, I think Ed had mentioned something about like having working capital, and the goal is that you get approved for this sum of money, but you're only going to have to use this, so you can have this nice cushion to be able to get off the ground and run with. Mick, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, talking location and, cold start, purchase, transition, what's your take on the role of location and kind of like optimizing everything?
Yeah, I had a patient years ago that worked for Jack in the Box, the hamburger chain. And he said to me one time, so Jack in the Box used to be corporately owned and they went franchise. And so they sold all their franchises. And he said to me that one of the metrics that was most closely associated with business failure was occupancy costs. And so he said they could control the price of a straw and how much you're going to pay for hamburger meat. But he said, if you got in over your head on occupancy costs, you're in trouble. And I'll tell you, the more I work with these cold starts, the more I see that. So a very easy way to think about occupancy costs is this. We want those occupancy costs to be less than 10% of revenue. So if you get into a lease where it's going to cost you, let's say, $60,000 a year, in order to get the metrics in line where they should be, you need a $600,000 revenue generating practice. But if you
Mick, I'm sorry to interrupt. Is that rent only, or rent and any leasehold improvements?
No, not leasehold improvements. I'm just talking about the monthly
rent and utilities.
Rent, utilities, security,
gotcha.
maintenance, all that stuff. So if you don't negotiate well, and now you end up having $90,000 a year in occupancy costs, now you need a $900,000 practice to get your occupancy costs in line with the metrics of a typical successful optometry practice. So a small, innocuous, bad decision can have a huge impact on the cash flow and when you become profitable. So I think not only where you choose to be, the location you choose to be, but also your ability to have a consultant that can help you negotiate good lease terms is a very important part of getting you faster into a positive cash flow situation.
Most of these folks have never actually negotiated a lease before.
I was just going to ask that. What's the average age of cold starts that have gone through your service, Eric?
Between the age of 30 and 45? Yeah. So
10 years out of school?
I mean, look, so we've got as recent as 2 years out of school, as recent as 13 years out of school, 15 years out of school. Absolutely.
But to your point, Jay, they're not.
It's a first. Yeah.
Negotiators.
Yeah.
Right.
And listen, they don't know what questions to ask. So that's really where that stems from. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know what questions to challenge. And they don't know where and when to negotiate. They don't even know what they need to open the door, and they're listening to everybody and their mother who's only interested in writing an order and doing what they need to do to support their own goals. And everybody's excited about that. It's like anything else, salespeople are salespeople. To that extent, it brings me back to where I started, and that's saying, how do we set up an ecosystem? I'm less concerned about locations. I think that's almost making a left turn for me. What the core is, we still have an answer. What can we do as an industry? What can frame companies, lens companies, what can we all do as an industry to help support and motivate the growth of independent optometry? It doesn't have to be cold start. It could be taking over an older practice. How do we help them take it over? How do we help them build up a practice where someone just ran up to $600,000 or $700,000 a year? They had a job and they still have brown shag carpeting and brown paneling, and actually the location's good, but nobody wants it, right? They'd rather merge with another practice. How do we bring the resources to bear to help that person get out the gate without starving?
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought the concept of a consortium. Alan, do you see people on forums that you host having regular conversations about this? Because I mean, Perry Brill said in his comment that you just have to be an entrepreneur. That's already winnowing down some segment of ODs. I don't see those conversations, but do people talk about, man, what does it take? Where should I go? Do we see that actively being discussed in forums?
A lot of the people in the communities who have these questions feel marginalized by the louder voices who already have done this and that and are talking about what you do further down the road. They're a little bit shy. They're a little bit afraid to say something somebody might come out and say something sarcastic or, something that kind of marginalizes them further in the group. So no, you don't see a lot of that sometimes. But when I do hear it is when I'm talking to students. And, the big question that students have, the top question on their minds for those who would consider starting a cold start or buying a practice is, how do I do that with so many loans? Like, how do I get out and take more loans? Like, is that doable? And the conversation I have with them is, I don't know, but I do know that there's two types of debt. There's bad debt and good debt. And that, in this environment, that banks are very, very willing to loan people to start optometry practices. But then again, a lot of these people don't have the collateral or the financial, the credit history to do that either. So it's a conundrum. It's a catch-22 for a lot of them.
Alan, just reminded me of something. There's one thing that's really interesting about lenders, and I'll be curious to see if Eric has encountered this as well. But I work with both buyers and sellers, and some in the cold start process, although usually after they've already gotten settled. And the banks actually often see a cold start as a lower risk than the acquisition of a practice. And especially because many optometry practices are not big enough to really cash flow the repayment of debt. So really, an optometrist might own a practice for 30 years and want to sell it. At the end of the day, when they're ready to sell it, they've really just created a job and not a business. And so the bank actually sees a lower risk with somebody who has the gumption to go in and do a cold start as opposed to acquiring an existing practice. I've never understood. If it were me, I would want to buy the biggest practice I can from just a cash flow standpoint. But the banks tend to shy away a little bit from those. And also, we seem to have a lot of young ODs wanting to do a cold start. Eric, are you seeing trends of, are we seeing more and more young ODs wanting to do cold starts these days?
I would say we're absolutely seeing, and once again, Mick, look, to put it in context, we launched in summer of 21, so we're in year 3. So this is so the data set that I'm going to share is fairly recent. But I would say, yes, there appears to be an uptick of people wanting to get into practice ownership. Now, that said, you bring up a really interesting point, and that is a bank's willingness to fund a cold start versus a bank's willingness to fund a purchase. I think the topic of transitions and purchases would make for a marvelous other episode of the Authentics unto itself, right? So to kind of drive it home to the cold start, yes, to Mick's point, the nature of modern optometry and providing to that bank, the business foundations, the financial pro forma, the business plan, the geospatial analysis of like, this is my vision for my practice. I mean, it's amazing. The banks want to play. And by the way, and this is where I suppose to kind of also put the caveat, if y'all haven't noticed, I do get very excited about this, right? So even if folks are like, hey, Eric's just filling us with a bunch of Eric energy. No, it's all factual. It's highly energetic, but it's all based in fact. And at the end of the day, when banks are willing to play, everyone needs to understand they are bearing the single biggest, I mean, even bigger than someone cold starting who this is the biggest decision of their life. I mean, I'll start by saying the chances of you not succeeding are very slim. I'll start by saying that, okay? But truly, the banks are there and they're going to invest in where they see opportunity. So if you're doing your due diligence in creating your financial pro forma, taking the time to create out that business plan, invest in the geospatial analysis, invest in everything you need to be able to make the case to that bank, it can happen.
Of success. So the definition of success is that you can pay the loan, you can pay your bills. Doesn't mean you're going to make a living. I know a lot of people came out of the gate that way. They spent years. I can personally remember, I can't count how many of these practices, but some of them I walked away crying. I literally, if I could have, I would have written the guy a check just to have him shut his door and make life easier. I've told people, listen, you're 5 years into this, you're 6 years into this, you're paying yourself 50, 60 grand a year, and you still haven't even started chipping away at your debt yet. You would have made more money working for somebody. So we really have to attack and go after these bad cold starts because they exist. Let's face facts, folks. A lot of people make a lot of wrong decisions because they don't have the right guides and consultants, and because they don't have the right support. And they get in way over the head and they think, hey, if I just could borrow another 50 grand, I could make it another year. Dude, you're just making the hole deeper. You're going to have a harder time climbing out. So I'm passionate about this, as you all are. I want to see independent optometry thrive. I want to see new openings. I believe that the industry is ripe for new openings, but I don't believe that all the cards are stacked where we need them to help these people really get out of the gate strong.
Agreed. I think cold start also there are many different definitions of cold start. When I purchased my practice from my father's estate after he passed away. You don't get given the practice, by the way, if your parent is.
Well, maybe you didn't, but a lot of other people did.
Well, my parents didn't love me, so of course, no, I'm kidding.
I understand that,
but I know you don't. But a lot of people don't. But when I also started a practice, and I worked there 2 days a week when I started, and I worked in other. I padded my income working other places, and I built it up from there. You don't have to, put $450,000 into decorating a practice right away. There's a lot of ways you can do that. And one of the ways is, the definition of independent has changed to a degree. A lot of the doctors, all the doctors who are leaseholders at big box, they're independent. They don't have opticals.
That's right.
They don't sell contacts. They're their own boss. It's very impressive. They can bring in any diagnostic, any therapeutic, and people don't even know what they do in their office there, and they're allowed to do that. And from there, that's a good springboard. You build up your records, and then eventually, once you have some of that debt paid down, you can transfer that into, if you choose, an independent or stay there. I mean, there's a lot of those are opportunities that I didn't have when I started.
Erich, we're coming toward the end of the session. You've got 60 seconds to tell the world what should be done. You're hearing Jay talk about industry getting together. What's the best advice you can give in a minute?
I mean, the best advice I can give in a minute as it pertains to those out there that are emerging practice owners. If you are that doctor out there that, hey, you know what? You got that vision to cold start. You got that vision to purchase a practice. Maybe you're an associate in a practice and you're like, hey, is now the time that I approach them and make the offer or make that phone call the other side of town? Do it. And don't shy away from it, because the fact is this: the public health need for what you're capable of doing is big, and there's no end in sight. It's just going to continue to grow. And the degree to which the scope of care that you provide continues to expand to serve that need, it's a really exciting time to be in optometry. I mean, truly, like, I am not cut out for health sciences. So this is the next best thing, is to support doctors and help doctors do that. But truly, when you do dig into it and spend some time, just do some online research, like remove yourself from the here and now and just like look at the forecast for eye care and the need for eye care, and realize that if your vision is something that is unto you to impact your community, providing that scope of care that you really want to provide, there's a lot of really great opportunity out there in practice ownership. And look, what this team is doing in the Authentics, this is the tip of the iceberg of a lot of really great independent resources out there to support you along the way. So, Scott, Alan, Jay, Ed, Mick, Essence, Jen, I know y'all aren't on right now, but thank y'all so much for the opportunity to fill in.
Erich, we're going to have you back, Erich. Thank you.
Erich Mattei, thank you for being here. We're going to let you go, and we're going to wrap up the session. Thanks for being around.
Thank y'all.
All right.
Thanks, Erich.
So, to start putting a wrap on this, Ed, you talked to us offline. I think Jay alluded to it, that, maybe not every optometry student anymore wants to be an independent practitioner, but you talked to a lot of practitioners that are independent practitioners. Are they motivated to be comfortable with industry companies getting together, building consortia, and letting us cold start down the road get a discount that they're not getting? Like, I think that's a point that I'm taking from this, that seems like it's one of those things you got to wrap your head around.
Well, I think the question is, what's it mean, and can you enforce an agreement or a contract? That would be my concern I guess it is my concern as a vendor. You could strike a very good financial program, but how can I enforce that a year or two from now? And I think Alan's point earlier is also very valid. You have to be very cautious. You can't support a cold start in a location where you might have 2 or 3 other accounts and provide, favored nations pricing for a year or two. And then, will the loyalty factor prevail, and that cold start will support you after the fact, or will somebody come along with another discount that's even better? So that would be my concern. I think there's a lot of factors here, and I know David's been very active in pointing them out, but I think we need to look at that and think about what that looks like. What do those cold start programs look like?
That's interesting, and I think there's so many ways to attack that. And Ed, I think you're right. I think everybody's right except for Alan. But no, just kidding around. But I don't even see it as special discounts. I see it as a way of subsidizing the practice while it grows. It's another form of debt that the practice can take on. But I think what we need to do is redefine how we can support these new startups with a different type of debt. I don't think they're getting more special pricing, but I think we are extending out, that first 18 months into a longer period of time.
You're talking terms.
And making money more available and making the terms easier so that they don't have to starve. A little starving is okay. A little starving keeps you hungry. You have to starve a little bit. But to that extent, I think we could put more people into business if we made that obstacle to opening up the door a little bit more cost effective.
It's very socialist of you, Jay.
There was a question earlier on in the chat about what is AOA, what are the schools and colleges doing to help, and kind of the implication of it was that they're not really helping. And I think we could talk about that. I think they would say that they feel like, ASCO is a different story, right? Because that's education. And we talked a little bit about debt earlier, but AOA in its form of advocacy, talks about things like group insurance capabilities, things that reduce your overall cost of practice. Do they help with practice location? Are they doing what iDoc and PECA and Vision Sources? No, they're not. I don't know that they're equipped for it. Does anybody have a sense as to whether AOA should be getting involved in this?
It's a question worth asking.
No, you'd have to look at their founding principles and what are, I don't know if that's.
I agree. I don't know if it's in their charter.
Yeah.
I would say that the revenue and profits of Dr. Alliance groups have a hell of a lot more of an opportunity to provide some sort of funding capabilities than a dues-driven professional organization that's trying to help our laws, stay clean and clear and advance the scope of care.
I got it.
And
how about everyone who complains about independents selling to private equity tithe towards new independent practices? Oh, no, I'm not going to do that. You're just not going to see that.
I'll jump on that too. I know you're on a board of a college of optometry, Alan, as I am. And I guess I just hit the college education thing, right? Our professors of optometry are not getting paid the way independent practitioners are. And it costs a lot of money to educate students. And I'm not justifying the cost of education completely, but if you're having an issue with what it costs to, or what it feels like to be a new person trying to figure out should they cold start or buy practice, then go ahead and donate to your College of Optometry. Open your damn checkbooks, people, because this profession and these degrees we've gotten have given us an incredible life. And rarely do our colleagues think about giving back. In fact, more often they come up with plenty of reasons to stiff arm the schools and colleges who would love to have you support their student body with scholarships and other things. So I, for one, am a fierce defender of the schools and colleges in that way.
Yeah, people would be amazed at how few alumni donate. It's in the single digits with the percentage. So please consider donating to your schools and colleges and help them develop these programs in education and business, which is what the students desperately need. I talked to 15 students in the past couple of weeks. We're trying to come up with some new ideas and ways to help them. And every single one of them talked about business education. And the last thing I'm going to say, because I know we're running out of time, is 30 years ago when I graduated, it was the same exact thing.
Yeah. And
any other final comments? Jay, go ahead.
How about a group of folks that would just be willing to take some newbies under their wing, spend some time with them, and teach them the insights, mentor them, send out a lifeline, say, hey, open up your practice and I'll be your lifeline. You can call me every day. And let me help you think through and talk through some of the decisions you need to make and make you understand that if you make this decision, you got 12 more coming. There's just not enough folks sticking their hands out and saying, hey, I'm here to help you. So in much with what Alan's saying, Scott's saying about donating, how about donating your time and your wisdom and the intellectual property that you have for the last 20, 30, 40 years of the mistakes you made, the successes you had, and sharing that on a one-to-one? That to me would be a stellar program.
Anybody else with thoughts?
Thought out.
Well, you guys have been incredible again. Thanks to everybody who's paid attention and participated. We're really grateful. We're going to shamelessly again ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel because that's how we know you'll get notified of our sessions. We're going to have another one in October. We're grateful for all you who showed up and gave us comments, and looking forward to the next sessions. Till the next time, you Authentics, be great. You guys
Thank you,
good tonight?
David. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
And thanks again, Eric. We'll see you around.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Bye, everybody.